Hey crew, it's your Captain Caliban speaking, and I wanted to let you know I talked for so long with today's guests, Maria and John Tenuto, that there was no way it was all going to fit into one episode. So be sure to tune in next week for our supplemental episode, where we'll have over 30 more minutes of chat from my conversation with them about Ricardo Montalban, Spy Kids, the script-to-screen development of Space Seed, Seduce and Destroy, Eugenic Superman style, and of course, Ricardo Montalban's chest. And let me tell you, don't believe what you hear. Like Benny Russell said, it's real! So please join us next week for that. And in the meantime, you can catch up with us on Facebook and Twitter at EISTPod, and you can join our crew at patreon.com/EISTPOD. And with that, let's get underway.
It's worked so far, but we're not out yet.
I want to know what you're thinking. There are some things you can't hide. I want to know what you're feeling. Tell me what's on your mind.
Pure energy. Pure energy.
Hailing frequencies open, and welcome to Enterprising Individuals, the Star Trek discussion podcast that boldly goes into excruciating detail about the series, characters, and stories of the Star Trek universe. I'm your host, Aaron Coker, a.k.a. Caliban, and you can go or you can listen to this show, but do it because it is what you wish to do. I'm joined on this episode by Maria Jose and John Tenuto. Maria and John are sociology professors at the College of Lake Country in Grayslake, Illinois, and they've extensively studied the history of Star Trek and employ Trek and other pop cultural examples in their classes. They've also given presentations on their work at Star Trek conventions. They are regular contributors to StarTrek.com, and they are featured in the new Netflix series, The Toys That Made Us, where they discuss the history of both Star Wars and Star Trek and the toys and collectibles associated with them. John and Maria, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here. Permission to come aboard granted. Today, we'll be talking about Space Seed, the 22nd episode of the first season of Star Trek, the original series. An episode that's probably best remembered for providing the seed, if you will, for the sequel Trek film Star Trek The Wrath of Khan. But it's also an episode that represented, in many ways, the best of what Trek had to offer as it reached the end of its first season. It's an episode that introduces an enduring villain, but it's also one that features standout performances, defining character moments, and detailed, thoughtful world building that would serve as story fodder for the next 50 or more years of Trek stories. And much of that can be attributed to the collaborative efforts of talented people working under restrictions that serve to inspire their creativity. And a little soft Corinthian leather never hurt. But we'll get to that later in the episode. First of all, let's talk your backstory. How did you become Star Trek fans?
Well, I started with Star Trek back in the 70s during reruns. I was alive when the original show was on, but a little too young.
Sure.
And I became a fan through, initially actually through the animated show and the toys.
Sure.
Got me inspired to love Star Trek. And then from there, it was watching the reruns and eventually, getting into the films and into the fan community.
Sure.
And I became a Star Trek fan through John. I was working on my master's thesis while he was catching up on Deep Space Nine.
Okay.
And I'd hear these names like Pa Wraiths and and I would, poke my head out and say, "Oh, what's that? What's going on?" And I was just sucked right in.
Sure. Even then, John, you must have had something of a collection going of Star Trek toys.
Oh, yeah. We were. That was before we were married. We're married about 20 years now, and that was a long time ago. I didn't have a room in my house. I was still living with my family at that time before we were married, but I had a large collection. A lot of it was in boxes, and now that we're married, we have it out, and we have a Star Trek collector's room, and it was played at our wedding. We had Star Trek music at our wedding. So we're a Star Trek family.
Sure. How did you light on the idea or the practice of using pop cultural examples such as Star Trek in your classes?
Well, that actually stemmed from, I think when you start teaching, you think of the best teachers that you had, and then you try to combine them and think about how you can, take what they inspired you to do and give that to the next group. And I had a teacher named Richard D. Cordova who passed away a few years after I had him as a teacher. He's a young man. He had cancer, unfortunately, but he used Superman in his classes, and that really caught my attention. He did a really great discussion about Superman 2 and gender and feminism, and it was a very interesting discussion. And so that planted the seed, if we're going to keep using space seed.
I suppose so.
And I started doing that in my classes, and Maria Jose does the same in her classes too. And it's just a really great way to teach by using popular culture that students are familiar with. Then you can kind of bring them to the sociology that they may be unfamiliar with.
Sure. What are some social themes that you use Star Trek to teach? What are some of the classic themes that Trek tends to tackle?
In my deviance class, I show the enemy within to talk about good and evil, and how it's kind of like the idea that you shouldn't tamper with your biology, with your DNA, because it shapes who you are. Mm-hmm. So Kirk needs his dark side, even though he doesn't like it and he doesn't want it. He talks about it's a thoughtless, brutal animal, and he doesn't want it, but he realizes through Bones and through Spock that he needs it. It helps him to be a great captain. And so we explore those ideas in the Deviance course.
And she uses Kirk, Spock, and McCoy to teach Freud, id ego, and superego.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, and somatology, yeah. And
then I use it more for the social themes, whether it happens to be in social problems. I do a section on environmentalism and particularly look at whaling. And, of course, we have Star Trek 4 for that, or even use Star Trek 5 a lot for environmentalism, kind of the opening 5-6 minutes of the film where you have Nimbus 3, which is a real-world location called the Owens Dry Bed Lake in California, and then you juxtapose that with the beautiful, El Capitan and what sort of what we could do and what we could do either way, with the environment, good or bad. And I think even though Star Trek 5 isn't really about that theme, that idea I think is in the beginning of the film. And I like to use that. But, obviously Star Trek's great. I mean, we love Star Wars too, but Star Wars doesn't lend itself. Star Wars is a little more, if you want to talk about religion, there isn't as much sociology in that. Star Trek is sociology. It's just sociology in a different way. Right. It doesn't do it through through the sort of scientific lens that you would as a researcher, but it does it through the sort of theoretical end of what sociology is all about.
Can you tell me more about your theory of the 20-year nostalgia cycle?
Well, if you take a look, if you want to understand a culture, there's a type of sociological theory called symbolic interactionism. And the idea is if you want to understand people, you have to understand their cultural items, their art, their entertainment, their sports, their music, whatever it happens to be. And that's how you can kind of understand people through the symbols that they use, whether it's language. If you use swear words, for example, you compare swear words, it tells you what people think is dirty or wrong or bad, right? Sure. That's why they make swear words. So, right. So the 20-year nostalgia cycle came out of that idea of us trying to understand, how does America function? And what we had noticed was, particularly growing up in the 70s, I noticed that a lot of 70s popular culture was 50s based. You had Happy Days and Laverne and Shirley and even MASH, and Godfather has sequences that are set, 20 years before the 70s. And so Grease, all of that. And so the idea kind of was there even back when I was a kid, but starting to think of how America tends to be nostalgic in 20-year waves. So when you take a look at the toys that we have, or the films, or the TV shows that are resurrected, not everything fits that pattern. Sometimes we're 30 years, but for the most part, we're 20 years nostalgic, partially because there's a generational difference. 21 years or so is considered a generation, and so you have a generation of parents now who 20 years ago were kids, and they want their kids today to maybe share the same kind of childhood experiences they had from 20 years before. Sure. So every single time we, see an announcement about a new TV show or a redo of a TV show, a remake of a film, we're always surprised at how many of them tend to be in that 20-year wave. And Star Trek fits into that too, right? Star Trek comes back.
Absolutely.
Right. In 20-year waves from particularly when you have the last original film to the time that you have the J.J. Abrams film is about 20 years.
Yeah. I suppose it's a reflexive thing too, that just creators grow up enjoying something, and then when they reach a point where they can produce something, they are looking back perhaps to their influences. A guy that grew up watching Battlestar Galactica wants to make a remake of Battlestar Galactica, 20 years later when he's in the entertainment industry.
Absolutely. Sure. You think of something like, part of it is too long-lasting characters. I mean, there might be something to a technological dimension to that too, because I've always thought that was true with Superman. So you have Superman invented in the 30s. You have TV coming into its own in the 50s, so you put Superman on TV. Mm-hmm. And then when we have the special effects of technology in the 70s to do Superman on the big screen, it comes into the big screen. Mm. And then almost exactly 20 years after the last Christopher Reeve movie, you get, Brandon Routh, because now we have CGI capabilities. So
right.
you almost get this, riding a wave too, I think, of a technological 20-year advancement as well.
That's interesting. How do you think that new technology such as streaming and even VR and things like that will project themselves into the future? What can we look forward to looking back on in another 20 years?
Well, it's funny. I think, if you take a look at something like Discovery, even the format of Discovery and the way that not just the special effects technology, but I think the arc-based nature of it, even though they're not sort of dropping all of the episodes on the same day, it is very much in the Netflix, arc-based. You really should watch them all in one sitting,
right.
Vibe to it, and that's very much a reality of the streaming world, where things can be more on demand than they would in the analog era when, you had to have a signal beamed to your house to watch TV. If I had to guess with the future, which is always dangerous, but I think we're going to move away from screens. I think that'll be the next big, it's probably already happening to some degree, but I think the next big thing will be the removal of the tether of the screen, and that somehow we'll be able to generate screens ourselves, through technology we wear on our wrists. So in class, I'll be able to literally pull up a map or pull up an image using like two devices on my wrists, and I'll just go shoot, and and it'll appear in some sort of holographic form. And I also think you're going to have much more integrated technology. So everything will be voice command. I think the idea of typing and touching, that's all going to go away too. So everything will be Alexa or Siri.
Okay. A fascinating and exciting way to watch The Bachelor in the future.
I'll watch it in class real fast. You can't hide your screen though that way. That's the problem.
Yeah. Other than the fact that it's a classic episode and it's a pretty entertaining one at that, why did you choose Space Seed to discuss on the show today?
The argument that we usually make is that Wrath of Khan is the most important Star Trek ever produced, because if it had not succeeded the way that it did, and it did spectacularly. I mean, it opened as the biggest film in all of history. I mean, it beat Empire Strikes Back. It had the largest opening weekend in the history of cinema when it opened on June 4th, 1982. But had it not been successful, I don't know that we would have had Star Trek again. Or if we did, it certainly would not have come in the same format as we have seen. It wouldn't have had that history. And so and Wrath of Khan, of course, wouldn't exist without Space Seed. So in many ways, Space Seed is the most important. It may or may not be the best episode, but it's certainly the most important episode of the original show ever produced, because it leads to Wrath of Khan, because of the influence Wrath of Khan had on the history of the franchise.
Sure. And in your work, you've had the amazing opportunity to study the archives of both Nicholas Meyer and Gene Roddenberry, which I'm sure gave you a lot of insight into the development of Space Seed.
Yeah, it was funny. We started with Wrath of Khan mostly because we were fascinated with the fact that film had been produced with such incredible limitations of time and budget and just the history of it. There's different trains of thought on this, and I never hate to say the definitive word is this or that, but Wrath of Khan was produced. It was initially produced under the idea of it being a television movie. And I know some people, even some researchers, disagree, but we have memos that really show that they're very specific that this was a TV movie of the week initially. The budgets were made for TV movie of the week. They did a budgetary comparison, TV movie of the week to film. And so the idea that this thing starts off as at least in the very initial phases, as a TV movie of the week and then becomes, such a classic science fiction major motion picture just fascinated us. And the idea of all these really talented behind the scenes people creating the characters and the special effects technology and the story, despite having budget and time and special effects and technology limitations on them. Just something that really fascinated us. And that's really our goal. Our goal is so that whenever we speak at a convention or at a talk, we want people to be able to go home and watch the film again and not only appreciate the film, but when the credits roll, be able to say, that there's Gain Rescher, and here's what he actually did. Here's how he contributed, or here's Carrie Wilbur. Now that name means something. I can put a face and a contribution to that name. When the credits roll, we want the credits to actually be something that's a living, breathing thing for people.
Yeah, and on the subject of having constraints and restrictions, Nicholas Meyer came into that project, and he thrived under all of the restrictions, really. I mean, he came onto a property that had 20 years of cultural cachet, and there was tension between Roddenberry and the studio, and you had stars that didn't want to come back, and there were several wildly diverging, drafts of the script. And he took all of those elements and 10, 12 days, he turns out a script that ultimately becomes Star Trek II, the one we know, and it sets a direction for Trek going forward. And as you said, in a lot of ways, saves Trek.
Oh yeah, I mean, you can't overstate Nicholas Meyer's importance to, I say if there's a Mount Rushmore of Star Trek, of course you have Gene Roddenberry's face on it, and you have Harve Bennett, and you have Michael Piller, and you have Nicholas Meyer.
Sure.
And I think that and I think Jerry Taylor too deserves to be on the Mount Rushmore because they really and Rick Berman. Now we're getting
we're going all the way around the mountain.
Now we're adding more faces to it.
Yeah.
I really, Nicholas Meyer really had when you think about the fact he's in his early 30s, he has not even directed a whole lot of films. Up to that point, he had only really directed one movie. And to come on to, to feel that pressure of, in essence, saving a franchise. And maybe it's good that he came in without the reverence, because
right.
I could see that being very devastating to a person coming in who had a long association or an emotional connection to it, but yet he understood it. He knew that the heart of that show was always the charm of the characters, and even though he didn't know Star Trek, he understood Star Trek, and that was vitally important.
And the way that he came to it, we have covered Wrath of Khan previously on a show last year, but the way that he came to it was so interesting in that he said, well, let's look at the military aspects. I see this as, Horatio Hornblower in space, not realizing that was Roddenberry's original kind of pitch or sort of concept for the thing.
Yeah, that just, I think, is the best example of how he understood what Star Trek was, and that really that it had a metaphorical quality to it, and that it was, and also I think important that it is us. I think that's something about Star Trek that makes it different than, say, Star Wars. Star Wars isn't us. Star Wars happens in another galaxy, and right. we can relate to those characters and imagine, and they can become our role models. But in Star Trek, these are our grandchildren. Right. And what we do here has consequences if we're ever going to actually get to that kind of future. And I think by seeing it as having a connection to the sort of exploratory and military aspects of things like the Coast Guard or the British Navy or whatever it happens to be, I think that really grounds Star Trek, and that he understood that was again really important.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Well, we're talking about the original series episode Space Seed. As I mentioned, it was the 22nd episode of the first season of the original series. It first aired on the 16th of February in 1967. The teleplay for the script was by Gene Kuhn and Carrie Wilbur from a story by Wilbur. And Kerry Wilbur was a television writer and journalist who had worked for the Toronto Globe and the New York Times. He was a television writer in the 50s, and he wrote for many shows that you'd know, such as Bonanza, Lost in Space, Tarzan, and The Time Tunnel, for which he reputedly contributed more episodes than any other writer for that show. And with The Time Tunnel showing up on MeTV and other nostalgia outlets, this might be the time to strike as far as getting my Time Tunnel podcast.
Oh, that's great. I mean, I love those nostalgia channels, because when you watch them, you really see it gives you almost a complete picture of whatever show you're into, whether someone loves Lost in Space or Star Trek or whatever. You watch Mission Impossible, you're like, hey, I know half the people on that show that are guest starring because they're from Star Trek.
Right. I want to reap that nostalgic return, so keep an eye out for the Time Tunnel podcast coming to you soon. Let's see. It was directed by Mark Daniels, who was a prolific director of the original series. And speaking of most contributions, he's tied with Joseph Pevney for the most episodes directed of the original series. The star date for this episode is given as 3141.9. And your assignment, John and Maria Jose, is, if you can, to give me a 25-word synopsis of Space Seed.
Oh, my gosh. Okay. It has to be exactly or less than.
Do your best.
I'm gonna be like my students and ask, can I write less than?
Yeah, right. Clarification.
Assignment? Well, I would say a beginning. My synopsis of the episode would be Captain Kirk meets his Joker, and the greatest villain in the Star Trek pantheon, and in doing so, we learn about our favorite characters.
I think that's pretty succinct. This is the point in the episode where I provide usually some interesting facts from memory banks about the episode, but I'm not going to be telling you guys anything you don't already know. So feel free to join in here or correct me if necessary when I get anything wrong. This is the first mention of the eugenics wars in continuity, which were originally equated with World War III. That was later retconned once we'd actually reached the 90s. We had Seinfeld and Pogs and Bill Clinton playing the saxophone, but we didn't get World War III. So that date was moved to 2026 for later stories such as Star Trek First Contact. And the eugenics wars themselves, which were also absent from our 90s, were recast in continuity as more of a secret conflict. Although I think their effects were possibly seen in 90210. Those are some good-looking kids. Genetically superior. You can read all about that era and the early life of Khan in former guest of the show, Greg Cox's two-book series, The Eugenics Wars, The Rise and Fall of Khan Noonien Singh. Something else that First Contact retroactively changed about the story is that the discovery of warp travel is established as being in 2063, of course, in the movie First Contact, instead of 2018, as MacGyver's reports in this episode. And of course, this episode features Ricardo Montalban in the role of Khan. I believe the casting of Montalban came from Joseph D'Agosta, who's the casting director for the series and several other Desilu and Paramount shows, such as Mission Impossible, Mannix, and The Lucy Show. I'm wondering, was that seen as a controversial choice at this time for the role?
No. We had the privilege to talk to Joe D'Agosta on the phone, and we asked him about the casting of Montalban, and he said that Roddenberry wanted him to hire the best actor, regardless of who they were. And Montalban had the physique, he had the acting ability, he would be a good rival for, Bill Shatner's Kirk.
Sure.
And so they changed the character to suit the actor.
I wanted to put in really quick that the Khan character had a record number of costume changes for a male performer on the show, as he wore 5 different costumes over the course of the episode. And I love that story about Joe D'Acosta just being like, okay, no, really, what's your chest measurement? Oh, no, really, that's it? Okay, wow, impressive. I was trying to think of who would have been the most costume changes for a female on Star Trek, and I was kind of running through my mental Rolodex, and all I came up with was maybe Susan Oliver in The Cage, because she's being so many different people.
I think that's probably a very safe bet.
Yeah.
I obviously Uhura had a couple of costume changes in Plato's Stepchildren, but I don't think anywhere near. I think she may have just had 2,
right?
Which would not have been a lot. Marlena Moreau might have, if we count her both universes, I suppose.
Okay.
She might have had 2 or 3.
Sure.
I think two seems about the average, right? I mean, you'll have like the Romulan commander in her costume or her military outfit, and then her more seductive,
right?
relaxed
Something more comfortable, yeah.
Yeah, but I think you're right. That makes sense.
And having, we're talking about having the Mount Rushmore. I'd like a few more faces added. I mean, you could definitely add Gene Kuhn in this case and DC Fontana for all the work that they did on scripts, sometimes receiving credit, sometimes just doing their jobs, getting those out. And also maybe, if not on the mountain, maybe name the gift shop after him, but definitely Robert Justman as the guy who, as you mentioned before, budget, kept things on track and went, yeah, we can't do a keel haul sequence. That's just not going to work. You got to bring the budget down here.
Yeah, there's a great memo by Justman on this. Kuhn loved the proposal by Wilbur. He called it the best proposal that they had received up until that point, and he was very excited about the possibilities of Space Seed. Justman, not so much. Justman has he likes it. He thinks it's imaginative, but he calls it more Buck Rogers.
Right.
And he wants to know. He really liked what they did with Charlie X, and in the memo he basically says, why can't we do more Charlie X and less Buck Rogers, basically? And then he starts talking about the cost of this thing, and just he compares the cost to the very first draft of City on the Edge of Forever, which would have been enormously expensive. Yeah. Right? If you read the IDW comic book, you can see what the original idea would have been and how expensive that. I mean, that would have been a major motion picture rather than an episode, and or could have been anyway. And so, Justman was that great combination of creativity and practicality. And I think that's something that a lot of those original Matt Jeffries, William Ware Theiss, they had that real world kind of practical, how do we solve this problem? But they were all really just incredible artists who brought to the table obviously a world-changing designs and ideas and imaginations. In fact, Mary Jo has we were talking about the costumes earlier, and she had noticed something about the costumes with the designs of them.
Oh, the ovals, the theme of the ovals. You see that in the first outfit that Khan's wearing, the mesh with it's like circles or the double helixes and a DNA. And then you've got that in the red jumpsuit with, by the neck, and then the jacket that he wears. And there's a little nod to that in the film Into Darkness.
Okay.
When the father's visiting his daughter in the hospital.
Yeah, his jacket has the little circle. The Theiss used little circles, or Mary Jo said, and it was interesting. Those look like DNA helixes in a way. And any new costume of Khan's from Space Seed has those helixes or circles on them, interlocking chain circles. And because of the 5 costumes he wears, 2 we saw before. One is an engineering outfit and a red shirt, although he doesn't die, and sort of the blue hospital outfit that he wears. We've seen those before, but the 3 that are original to him in that episode are all with those helixes, and then you do see that in Into Darkness. They did a good job in Into Darkness with the clothing as a hint. And so you have those double helixes on the father, and then you also have, when Khan is on the Klingon world, or John Harrison is on the Klingon world, he has a jacket on, and the collar of that jacket is the same as the collar worn by Montalban and Wrath of Khan in his costume. So,
interesting.
There's a lot of fun little inside. I mean, when they filmed Into Darkness, the name was not Harrison. They filmed it as Erickson. And you can see that on some of the deleted scenes, and then they dubbed over Harrison. Okay. On top of that, I think they might have realized that it wasn't much of a secret if you named him Erickson.
I know that Cary Wilbur originally sort of wrote this script or had this idea for when he was writing on Captain Video and his Video Rangers, which is not a podcast I think I could get off the ground at this point. I'm not sure there's a lot of fans left of that. But the idea that there would be like ancient Greek people who are cryogenically frozen and then wake up in the future of Captain Video, and they have these, ancient Greek sort of superpowers, and that sort of gets turned into him being a criminal, but then later having the aspect added of, oh, he's genetically engineered, which must have been a really exciting sort of idea for people in the 60s.
Yeah, that was really very, very close to filming. That was all in those, really Roddenberry is the one that kind of handwrites in the idea of genetic Superman or genetic ideas. And Kuhn is the one that recognizes that he needs to be bigger than he was in both the outline and in Wilbur's first draft, because part of the problem was that it was they kept alive the captain of the sleeper ship, which was always named Botany Bay, even from the very initial outline. But initially it had 100 criminals on it, and it had 6 crew, and one of the crew was going to survive, and his name was Henderson. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of Space Seed's original kind of conception was kind of Erickson constantly breaking out of the brig without anybody knowing it, and trying to, and then eventually killing Henderson to keep the secret of who he actually was. Sure. And it was very, very convoluted, and it was Kuhn that kind of recognized we need to get rid of this Henderson guy, because this is just, it's straining credibility. This guy is like able to, if he's going to leave the ship, he doesn't need anybody. I mean, if he can leave the brig, he doesn't need anybody, right?
Right.
But he really begins when he's Harold Erickson. He's really just a criminal, and even in the October 26th draft, the sort of the last version that Wilbur Kerry Wilbur writes, he's still kind of just a criminal. He doesn't necessarily have any biological superiority. Mm-hmm. But what I thought would have been amazing and was never explored is one of Roddenberry's handwritten notes is that Khan would hate Spock because Spock was a half-breed.
Right.
And that him being genetically superior and genetically pure, he would almost have a fascist attitude towards Spock.
Okay.
And see Spock as an inferior. And that's in Roddenberry's notes, but they never really did anything with that. In fact, they didn't do anything with that at all.
Well, we can get to Khan's kind of shades of fascism in a little bit. I want to talk about Madeleine Roux really fast, of course, who plays Lieutenant Marla McIvers. She'd starred in over 20 films during her career, was a frequent guest star on TV shows in the 60s and 70s, and had a recurring guest role on Murder, She Wrote in the 80s. And it's a fun fact that Ricardo Montalban and Madeleine Roux were in an episode of Bonanza together earlier in the 60s, where she plays his wife, and she's killed, and he goes off seeking revenge for the death of his wife, which is awfully similar to the plot of Star Trek: The Wrath of Khan.
It's very similar. It's a 1960s episode called Day of Reckoning.
Oh.
And we had actually asked Joe DiAgusta, did he know that they had already played sort of husband and wife together,
right,
in Bonanza? And he said, no, he didn't know that. And had he known that, he would have not cast the two of them together.
Okay, all right, interesting.
Yeah.
Roux was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis in 1977 and was confined to a wheelchair for the last part of her career. And her character of Marla was originally in the draft of Wrath of Khan, but when Harve Bennett and the production learned of her condition, they wrote the character out because she would not be able to reprise her role. And speaking of wheelchairs, Montalban himself, unfortunately, needed a wheelchair in his final years due to a back injury that he suffered while filming Across the Wide Missouri in 1951. And in the later seasons of DS9, and I didn't know this and it fascinated me, apparently the writers kicked around the idea of having Montalban reprise his role as Khan on the show, but the plan was scrapped when they learned that the actor's health would not permit him to appear.
Right. Ricardo Montalban, even though he's confined to the wheelchair, he's using a hand bike every day, and he's really building up his upper body strength. And so another question we always get is that his chest? And yes, that was his chest. He really, you could watch Fantasy Island, and there's episodes where he's swimming in the ocean and, he's topless, and you can see that is indeed his chest. And so the director of Spy Kids, Robert Rodriguez, was inspired to create the character that way because of the way Montalban still carried himself even in a wheelchair and the strength that he had.
Yeah, that's really ask Robert Rodriguez, ask Joe DaCosta. They both can tell you that's his real chess for real.
That's his chess. Yeah, and if they had only had the technology that they have today when they were making Deep Space Nine, it's possible he might have been able to reprise his role, kind of like he does in the Spy Kids films, where they have him walking around, but obviously in a CGI sort of format. Sure. And he is so much that role. I think some of the reaction people had towards Into Darkness, part of that may have been the fact that it's very hard to replace Montalban in that role. It's very hard to imagine anyone else in that role, no matter how good an actor they are.
This is the only appearance by John Winston as Chief Kyle, Transporter Chief Kyle, in which he has no dialogue. He gets KO'd immediately by Khan. And this is also, speaking of the Transporter, the episode that establishes that Dr. McCoy does not like the Transporter and having his atoms scattered around. I wanted to check with you. I've always heard this urban legend, and I assume that you're going to know the answer to this, that Khan Noonien Singh was partially named because Gene Roddenberry had a friend that he was trying to make contact with.
Yeah, that is true. The original name that that Roddenberry, when he takes the Ragnar Thorwald character and wants to Montalbanize him, if that's a word, he names him Sybil Khan Noonien is the first version of the name. Then DeForest Research, no relation to DeForest Kelley, but a research company that they used, named DeForest Research, made a suggestion or recommendation that, if we're making him a Sikh and we're going to be consistent and ethnically sensitive, really you can't have the name. You need to put the name Singh in there, and so they had Govind Badahir Singh was going to be his name. Okay. In which case, then Roddenberry kind of splits the difference and calls him Khan Noonien Singh. Sure. So he consistently puts Noonien back in there, and then of course very similar sounding Noonien Singh for Data's creator.
Right.
And Roddenberry tells the story that he did that because he had a friend that he had met whose name was Noonien, and he had hoped that his friend would hear this very unusual name, or someone would hear it and sort of make a connection between that episode and the writer or the producer of that episode being Roddenberry, and that maybe he could reconnect with his friend that way.
Sure.
Which is why he kept using that name.
That's such a interesting. That's a message in a bottle. It's a message in a show trying to reach this guy. Like, why didn't he just hire a PI or something to go look for this person?
He's more creative than that.
I guess. I'd like to call out McCoy for one of my favorite scenes in this episode, and what I think is just a great example of McCoy's character, where he initially is checking on Khan when he's in sickbay, and Khan, is resourceful and wily, and wakes up, grabs him by the neck, and puts a knife up to his neck. And we get one of those moments that I love from McCoy, that when he's in danger, he just goes, he's ice cold. Like, he's the guy who's always grousing about something. He's always complaining. He's scared of the transporter. But in this and other episodes, like when his life is in danger, like he's immediately like super businesslike. And he's like, hey, choke me, stab me, whatever you're going to do. Let's get to it here. Come on. What's going on? And it kind of saves him with Khan later, because Khan's like, okay, yeah, you're pretty brave.
Yeah, that's what I when I was doing my 25-word summary, those are the kinds of things that I was thinking about, was how, really good villains exist really to help the hero, right? The classic idea of the way that we do any good story is the stronger the villain, the bigger the challenge, the better your hero, and that you really need to have a villain that reveals something about the hero in addition to themselves. And Khan really interacts with all three of them, all three of the main characters in unique ways. He has his sort of battle of wits with Spock, yes, both at the dinner table and also at the end of the episode. And he has a physical battle and intellectual battle with Kirk several times in the episode. And he also has his moment with McCoy too. So I think, and in each of those we get an idea, a revelation about who our favorites are and what they are about and how they deal with the situations that they come up with. I love the scene where they're talking about how they could admire him, even though they despise him. Right? That there's that what he did was wrong, but that to accomplish what he accomplished. is something where you could say, okay, you have to give him credit for that, although he's reprehensible, and so
Right.
and that he was the best of the tyrants, like the nicest of the tyrants,
Right.
So which is just made even better by. You mentioned Greg Cox books; those books are just fantastic. The two, and then the third follow-up book that he does with Khan on SETI Alpha 5. But I think it's just a beautiful reimagining of who Khan was, and I thought it did such a great job. Anybody who loves Space Seed or Wrath of Khan should definitely check out Greg Cox books.
Yeah. I want to dig into the character of Khan, and especially him being the nicest tyrant. But I wanted to mention first that scene that you just mentioned with Spock kind of grilling Khan at the dinner. And we were talking about Nick Myron before. That dinner scene reminds me a lot of the dinner scene in Star Trek VI, where it seems to be friendly, but there's a subtext to the conversation. Like, people are maneuvering in this conversation to get people to admit things or to say things that have to do with their agenda, and Spock is not going to let this guy off the hook. And I like the fact that he essentially gets him. Khan is trying to defend his methods as well. It's not tyranny. I'm trying to unify humanity. And Spock's got that great line. Oh, you're going to unify him like a team of animals. That's great. That's great. he really nails him there. And then of course Khan points out what's going on, which is that Kirk's letting his second in command kind of maneuver and do all this while Kirk can sit back and watch. And that's the kind of thing that Khan, the nicest dictator, he can admire that sort of strategy in his opposite, in a man that he sees to be kind of like himself. The character of Khan is very charismatic, like a tyrant would need to be. And I think the episode really dares you to hate him, to not like him. From the moment they pull him out of that space microwave that he's in, when he's on defrost, he's a striking figure, and I think he's perfectly cast as Montalban. And MacGyver's is certainly buying what he's selling in this case. They immediately, just from a filmic perspective, they code this as, oh, she's into this guy. Like, we got to watch out.
Yeah, and I think that really is a lot of that is, the relationship, the charisma between Madeline Rue and Ricardo Montalban is very important to selling this episode, because that is when you look at the memos and the sort of behind the scenes struggle, a great deal of that struggle was making Marla a believable character. She just she needed to be, they only have 51 minutes to tell this story. Yeah. So you can't give her 3 months to fall in love with him. She has to fall in love with him instantly.
Right.
And so, how do you do that, and how do you do that believably? The way that they do that is really clever, right? They make her a history buff, so she automatically has an affinity for things of the past. And here is literally a man from the past.
Right.
And she's the scenes that are edited out between her originally, that Mary Jo had spoken about it with Rand, but the scenes that were edited out were kind of this idea of her, that the modern man that she had around her was never as fascinating to her as men of the past, and that she really so the first thing we get to know about her is that men of the past hold an attraction for her. And I think that was smart. And also having Montalban be there and to have him be so intelligent and charismatic and really being what does he want? What is Khan's motivation? And so the Khan in Wrath of Khan is different. The Khan in Wrath of Khan is violent. He is really lost his mind because of the revenge that has poisoned his heart and his soul. So he's not, when Yaukum tries to get him to see, look, we have a ship. You have defeated Kirk. We can take the ship and go someplace else and start a whole new life. He denies his people's future.
Right.
Because of his revenge, Khan. And so, and this madness that he has and this desire that he has, that's very different than the Khan that's in Space Seed. This Khan that's in Space Seed is very intellectual, very measured, not as quick or prone to anger, although he does have a temper. And the reason he's doing it is not personal megalomania. He really truly believes that him and his people were designed to bring humanity to a better future, and that the humans who have not been so blessed with the genetic background that he has are not capable of bringing that kind of order.
Right.
And so he's made that way. He's designed and made to be like that.
And Ricardo Montalban spoke of that on QVC, where he was asked, I believe it was by Bob Bowersox, what is it like to play a villain? And Montalban's response is, I don't play a villain. I play a man who does villainous things. And that it's circumstances that have brought him to that point.
Huh.
And you really see that the way he plays that in Space Seed, because he really is. He's not justified, but he has justification to himself. He is not walking around going, "I'm a bad guy. I'm a bad guy."
Right.
He isn't delighting in. He doesn't delight. He almost begs them. Not, he doesn't want to hurt anyone. He'll do it because it's necessary for his plans. But he's literally begging, the crew, saying, "Don't you understand what this means? Don't you understand what I'm going to do?" And so that's very different than Wrath of Khan, which is great because it shows you how that loss, destroyed who he was. That's why I'm hoping we hope and we pray that Nicholas Meyer is currently typing and working on this
Khan project,
Khan show, which I can certainly see as a possibility. I think CBS is well aware that they have to find something to, it's been a long wait in between Discovery episodes here.
Right.
But it's going to be even a longer wait in between season 1 and 2. We had to wait 6 weeks or 7 weeks now. We're going to have to wait months for the new season, and we're going to need Star Trek content. And my hope is that they're going to see this as an opportunity to do, one-off movies or one-off TV shows or something like that. To really do what Star Wars is doing in a way with these anthology films, but do it in the way that's perfect for Star Trek with his anthology TV.
Yeah, hook up with Greg Cox and maybe adapt his books there.
Oh my gosh, that would be fantastic. I think, and that's why I'm hopeful that that's what's going on right now, and that we're because I think Khan is such a fascinating character, and to see what his life would be like as he sort of struggled to build a new world, I think would be just an amazing show.
Our characters in the 23rd century have certainly mastered this sort of detachment that you've talked about in seeing characters or events from the past, because they're very admiring of Khan, which I think is possibly understandable, but it's weird, especially for this show. And there's this weird detachment from responsibility for all these events that happened in the past. Like, they look back at this tyrant who was, of course, the nicest tyrant, and they're admiring him. They also, Spock is talking later about the attempts to improve the race through the selective breeding that led to the Supermen, and McCoy's like, "Oh no, that wasn't us. That was some scientists long time ago." And Trek hasn't seemed to pick up yet that sense of that the cultural responsibility. We are the products of our ancestors' successes and failures, and there's things that we're kind of responsible to. They seem to just kind of toss that right off, like, that's just other people. It's not us.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, I think they were. I do like how we have this sort of through line in Star Trek that genetic manipulation is illegal.
Right.
Because they saw what it could do, and they always use sort of Khan as one of the names in the mix of names that they mention of the people that you want to avoid that kind of that sort of a future. It's funny because I think that the Khan character, when we sort of imagine like, what does that mean to be the nicest tyrant, right? Does that mean that he wanted to control the world, but he wanted to do it in a way that he wasn't as violent. He didn't have, camps for people. He tried to limit, collateral damage or civilian casualties, or sort of what could that possibly mean? I do wonder whether that line is in there to justify Marla's attraction. In other words,
Okay.
you know, I that may be part of that problem solving where, like, well, look, Kirk and Spock, well, not Spock, but Kirk and McCoy and Scotty, you know, they respect him as sort of a man-to-man respect, and so therefore we could sort of see the idea that Marla might also respect him.
Right, but it keeps her from straight crushing on Hitler.
Exactly, right, which is just kind of, I mean, because otherwise, you know, you wouldn't know what world it would be, and then there would be no way they could have that ending, right? I mean, if
the ending too, yeah.
Yeah, because that is an unusual ending for 60s TV, because there very much still was that mentality, that almost Hays Code idea, or comic authority code idea, that you needed to punish the bad guy, needed to be punished at the end of the story. And really, Khan is, but he isn't. He is punished, but he's not punished. He's given what he wants, which is a world to conquer.
Right.
And he's given a bride to do it with. And so
Yeah.
that's unusual, very much for TV back then.
Yeah, and especially as he's going out, his exit line is basically ruling in hell instead of reigning in heaven or whatever. And they're like, yeah, that's cool. And I'm like, yeah, Satan said that. Like, who are you admiring here?
Yeah, it's funny. It's like, because you compare that to, like, you know, Mission Impossible, which is the companion show, of course, to Star Trek,
Right.
made by the same studios and people. And, you know, every episode of that show ends with gunshot. You know, as they're walking away, the bad guy gets killed
Right.
or
Yeah.
arrested. I mean, there's never any ambiguity on that show about what happens to the bad guy.
Yeah.
But Star Trek, being maybe a little more sophisticated and less formulaic, was willing to play around with the format a little bit. And that, I thought that was really, I mean, they did do that. When you look at, like, you know, Mudd, he's a con man, but he's, you know, a lovable con man.
Sure,
and,
sure.
you know, there isn't that the concept of good and evil in Star Trek isn't as defined as it is at a lot of other 60s TV shows. And I think that's, again, Roddenberry's kind of genius in the idea that, as Mary Jo was saying, with Enemy Within and those sort of themes of, you know, even the Klingons, you know, the Klingons were not entirely despicable on the original show, and
Sure.
obviously were likable enough that they emerged as a well-loved species. So Star Trek really did that well, and I think Khan's probably a good example of that. Although, again, we look at it now and we go, you know, gosh, why would Marla go with him? He's such an abusive person, or he's a bad guy, and he is a bad guy.
Oh yeah.
But in that sort of Roddenberry way.
Yeah, and as a show, Star Trek would certainly come down. It would roundly condemn fascism and tyranny later on, especially in episodes like Patterns of Force. And Kirk, as a captain, has no time for tyrants or bullies, you know, over the course of the show. But when you have a guy like Khan, who is, they're at dinner, he's going full alt-right before the salad course comes out. Like, I just wonder why the show gives him so much latitude. And I think it has a lot to do with, you know, with having this powerful character played by a powerful actor.
And by having him, I think that concept of, you know, if he's going to be a mirror to Kirk, and you do wonder, you know, had Kuhn stayed with the show, or the show gone a fourth season or whatever, would they have made their own sequel? Because they certainly did sequels.
Wasn't there a line too that didn't make it to air? That's something to the effect of, like, wow, I hope we don't see that guy again.
Yeah, there was, interestingly, there was a lot of concern over the use of the word seed.
Oh,
Because of the connotation that he was going off with a girl.
oh,
And sort of, you know,
right.
where that's going, right? So
I didn't get that, but okay.
I would never have thought of that myself, but that's actually in the memos where they're like, well, you know, you might. So they really do a linguistic feat there, where they make sure that you understand they're talking about an agricultural metaphor.
Son of
not
Khan, right?
Yeah, no other kind of metaphor. And so, you know, they had to dance with that ending a lot, and sort of how to do that, and how to show that there is a, you know, some punishment, but not really, and
Right.
that was initially the conception. The original idea was that he would be kind of stranded.
Sure.
and left in the modern world, because that's just a fascinating idea. Wilbur had a great premise. What would happen if somebody from 500 years ago came into the 1960s?
Right.
You know, what would their life be like?
Yeah, the Encino Man of 60s sci-fi.
Exactly.
As we start to wrap up here, were there any scenes or moments or specific characters that you haven't mentioned yet that really stood out for you in this episode?
Well, you know, I certainly would have loved to have seen more of Khan with his own people. Mm-hmm. You know, because really both Wrath of Khan and Space Seed are dependent on that, but we don't really get to see that much. We get to see more of that in Wrath of Khan, where we get to see some interaction there. But in many ways, he's older than, you know, it's almost like they're all the kids of the other people, right. You know. You know, my favorite moment in the whole episode is the dinner sequence. I love that because that's just raw acting. I mean, I think that's always a dangerous thing, and Nicholas Meyer is great at that. He writes a great scene in Star Trek IV where they're basically, I mean, that should be the death knell of any film, right? It would be sitting in a pizza place for 10 minutes talking to one another. But because they're such good actors and the dialogue is so good and it's charming and funny, that's a great scene. Or in Star Trek VI, you know, a motion picture by definition should be in motion. Right. And instead they're all sitting there, but yet it's, as you were saying, brilliantly directed and written and acted. And I feel that same way about this scene in Space Seed where they're sitting around and it's really a battle. There's so much subtext in that scene, and it's a fight that's even better than the fight at the end because they're doing it with their brains.
Right. Yeah. I think Uhura has a great moment in this episode where they're in the briefing room and they're trying to get her to, I can't remember specifically what they want her to do, but something with a computer. And 60s politics or sexual politics or no, like Joaquin just belts her right off the bat. And she looks up, and you can tell that hit has had no effect on whether she is going to do what they want her to do. She's not going to do it, and he can just keep hitting her, but it's not going to change anything.
That's I mean, you know, she did so much, really with so little screen time, you know, per episode, because again, the way that the TV was structured then with the three, you know, main characters and that sort of thing. But that is one of the best moments for her. I love that moment. I love the moment when she's underneath the console in a different episode and she's working on the console and Spock's like, you can handle it, you know?
Yeah.
I love when she teases Spock. I mean, the idea of Spock and Uhura together in the new movies makes perfect sense when you look at some of the interactions that Spock and Uhura have in the original show, and she comes up and she sort of teases him, you know, like, you know, do people on your planet do this, you know, and
right.
and they sing together, you know, and she, you know, they have musical relationship with one another, so that Spock has this kind of respect for Uhura, I think, shows you what an incredible character she is. And Nichelle Nichols, just the way she'll say a line like, you know, neither, you know, she's like right. Fair and, you know, a lady, neither, you know, she's so great. And that was a wonderful moment that you picked out because she is as defiant with a single look as 10 pages of dialogue could have given her.
Yeah. I also like Khan's calisthenics or his yoga or whatever he's doing before he wrenches the door open. It's got a little bit of that kind of mysteries of the Orient, like 60s soft racism thing going on, but you know, he's really strong and he rips a door open.
I do that every morning when I get
you have
up.
to, right? That's
how I stretch. when I get out of bed, I go, and that's how I stretch in the morning. I do my Khan. It works. I mean, I can't rip a door open, but it's whatever he's doing, he was doing right. There's some isometrics there.
Yeah. Something else I thought was cool, and this might be a bit of a stretch. Maybe this is my crackpot theory for the episode, but when Khan and Kirk fight in engineering after he crushes Kirk's phaser, and you have to do a lot of yoga before you can pull that off, Kirk beats him he beats him with this stick thing that he pulls out of the engineering console that we never see again on the show. And to me, and maybe I'm crazy, but it reminded me of a belaying pin, which is on an old style ship. You know, there are these things called belaying pins for sailing vessels, basically, where it's a stick that you tie the rigging to. But if you get into a fight and you're a sailor, that doesn't have a fancy sword like the captain, and you're being boarded, you could grab one of these things and boom, instant nightstick. And the fight between Khan and Kirk, or I should say Khan and Kirk's stunt doubles, Gary Combs and Chuck Couch, you can really tell it's them on the remasters and the long shots.
Oh,
Absolutely.
The fight doesn't have any real thematic significance, except Kirk does win because he knows his ship better than Khan. He's a sailor. And I bet those club things weren't in the schematics.
No, it's funny. That is, you see so much of the design. I mean, even the in that episode, the chamber that Kirk is put into. I mean, the window of that is a porthole,
right?
And the way that they refer to the original conception when Mary Jo was talking about him being. The original idea was that Kirk was going to be put in a space suit and then put into space and then slowly denied air,
right.
And that was too expensive. And so, and they didn't have spacesuits designed at that time when they were writing the script. And so, the idea of putting him in sort of this the decompression chamber, all of that, just the language of it, the keel hauling and all of that is so nautical, and really shows Roddenberry's Horatio Hornblower connection and Matt Jeffries and his love of naval vessels and the real world military experience that all those guys brought. I mean, Kuhn. Kuhn had, 2 tours, World War II and in Korea. A lot of the anti-war themes of Star Trek, come out of Kuhn. Who's the guy who comes up with the Prime Directive, who comes up with the Klingons. It's all Kuhn. I mean, Kuhn really should be on the Mount Rushmore, so we do have to add another face. But a lot of the anti-war stuff in Star Trek is Roddenberry and Kuhn together, because they saw it in real life.
Yeah.
And so the idea of the sort of real life creeping in and the designs of the ships and stuff like that, that's all what those guys were really able to bring to that show.
And I think I remember reading it might have been in one of your articles, the fact that in the original treatment or script draft by Wilbur, it was a little too militaristic. Kirk was a little too clipped in sort of his delivery, and they had to explain to him, no, Kirk is, he's a guy who can relate to his subordinates and stuff. But that sort of military flavor, I think, still exists into the finished product of this episode. Yeah,
I've always, we've interviewed some military fans over the course of our research, and just to try to understand Star Trek a little bit, because there's always that debate, is it the military, is it not the military? And, Roddenberry, we have all of his memos about Wrath of Khan and his thoughts on Wrath of Khan, which are just brilliant. And one day we really have to share what's in there because they're just incredible. I mean, and it's funny because he doesn't care. I mean, he cares about the kind of like nitpicky stuff that fans care about, but he understands that sometimes you have to throw that out the door for a good story.
Sure.
He was very much more concerned about like the heart of the characters and making sure the science, worked and that there was a logic to the story and the spirit of it. He was very concerned about that. So I think, Roddenberry really understood that those kinds of ideas, and you see that in the original show, and you see that in anybody who kind of tries to adhere to that Roddenberry vision. But he was insistent in those memos that Starfleet is not military.
Right.
But it has some of the trappings of the military as an organizational structure.
Yeah.
And the more and more fans we talk to, the more and more we get that if we want to understand Star Trek, you have to understand the Coast Guard, because the Coast Guard has every one of the missions of the crew of the Enterprise is the mission of the Coast Guard. They are a rescue agency. They are an exploratory agency. They do scientific research on the natural and social worlds and everything, just like they do on Star Trek. And of course, if needed, they're called in for military service. So although Star Trek sort of feels like the Navy per se, it's a little more closer specifically to the Coast Guard.
That's fascinating. I wanted to ask you before we go, early in some of the early script drafts, there's this idea of the criminal, whatever his name is, kind of hiding who he is and trying to hide the fact that he's this criminal from an earlier time, which doesn't really quite survive down to what we actually get in the episode. Do you remember when that sort of got dropped from from a focus in the script?
Yeah, the memos by Kuhn, the early September memos to Wilbur. So because Wilbur is still the script writer at that point,
right.
And one of the things that he kind of discusses is this idea that, this concept of when Wilbur sets up the world of the 1990s in the outline, it's a dystopian world where we have had this war. And he even has a great line in there where he says, I had written it down because I love that line. Oh, penalties are no weapons against despair.
Yeah.
So there are so many people that are so hungry that, a lot of people are criminals. So what they do is they create these argosies where they put criminals into these sleeper ships and they send them off for 1,500-year journey to a planet called SETI 2.
Sure.
And so what's interesting about that is the concept of, well, let's free the planet of these criminals because we don't have enough resources. And what Kuhn argues back to Wilbur is, if they don't have the resources, they do not have the money to send people into space.
I can see that.
Right?
Yeah.
So the idea of him being a criminal and that this is a criminal sleeper ship, that kind of starts to be weeded out in that first draft that Kuhn does, because it's still in the draft, except that what they do is they made him like a super important criminal.
Sure.
And one that had controlled the part of the earth, and like it's more like an escape type of a vessel and that kind of thing.
Okay.
But it's still a criminal sleeper ship in Wilbur's version. When he gets to Kuhn's the one that really starts stripping that away. Just from a logic point of view, you can see he doesn't like that right away.
Originally, it's more akin to the historical practice of transportation, although it's a different kind of transportation than we're used to on Star Trek.
Yeah, it's basically an Australian. The idea was concept like they're creating an Australia in space, and it's a penal colony,
right.
And we're going to just send people there, and you sleep for 1,500 years, and then the Botany Bay, there's a problem with the ship, and the people start waking up 500 years, and there's a mutiny on the ship, and only this Henderson guy survives, right. And so that alone would have been very expensive if they were going to film it.
Yeah, and really kind of chunky as far as the script structure is concerned.
Absolutely, yeah.
Khan's not even really trying to hide who he is all that much. I mean, there's a bit when he wakes up in sickbay, and he's a little cagey about giving his name, but he eventually does. And when he does, I guess he doesn't know what time period he's in, but did he think nobody was going to remember the name Khan or like look him up? It's like a guy with a tiny little mustache wakes up in sickbay. Can we ask your name? Hitler. Got a first name? No, just Hitler. I mean, that's not going to last long.
Yeah, I have always wondered whether or not when he says his name, he expects a reaction kind of like, oh, Khan, like, you're great, okay. Like, we love you, like, sure. Boy, because he has this megalomaniac, right? He has that element of himself that's bred into him, right, where he's superior.
Okay.
And then he kind of real fast gauges it and says, when he says, that's it, Khan, and then sort of, Khan's like, well, this isn't going like I think. So, yeah, it's just Khan. That's all you need to know for now.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, that whole idea of hiding the identity is obviously much more important into darkness, and just a slight echo in this. But there's a lot of that in the original Wilbur idea of him trying to hide. He's trying to hide that they're criminals.
Yeah.
Not so much who he was, because he was just kind of a regular old criminal when he was Erickson at the very first version. Sure. But he's trying to hide that they're criminals and that they killed the crew.
Yeah.
And what his goal is to kind of get to this Henderson who's kind of out of it, but alive in the sick bay, before he can tell them that they're criminals, because he wants to, be set free.
Sure.
And so that's where that whole sort of secrecy thing comes from, and really you don't get much of that in the final version.
Yeah. Well, this is a classic episode. We've talked about the ways that ideas can get kicked around and modified and changed, the ways things that could have gone differently, but it's amazing to see what a strong vision the writers and creators of Trek had, even this early on, that they could deliver an episode and a character like Khan that would prove so enduring.
Oh, it's such an if you strip everything away and take away Wrath of Khan and everything else, it's just a great episode. I mean, it deals with what in the 60s was a very kind of a breakthrough idea of genetics. I mean, of course, people were talking about eugenics back in the 20s through selective breeding,
Right.
But the idea of sort of going in and messing around with, DNA and that sort of thing is really at the Star Trek's dealing with a very imaginative idea at that time. And the way that, it's a good action adventure story. It's a good intellectual battle. It's a great challenge for Kirk and the crew, and it's a great bottle show and shows you a lot about our main characters, whether it's Uhura, like you had mentioned, or Spock or McCoy, through Khan. I think that's a really great episode for that reason.
Yeah, I agree. Well, let's talk My Space Dad Can Beat Up Your Space Dad. Who's your favorite captain and why?
Star Trek is like pizza. There's no such thing as bad pizza. No bad pizza, no bad Star Trek.
Diplomatic.
If I had to choose which captain, I would say Kirk, not because I think he's a better captain, but because of my emotional attachment to him being my first captain.
Okay.
And him leading me into the world of Star Trek. But I love them all. I mean, Sisko, every single one of them, Janeway has Archer, they all have traits that I admire, and I think they are all great hero characters. I mean, I love Janeway. I think she's such a great character, and I would have loved to have seen her I would love to have seen a Voyager film and her in a movie. I mean, just with a big budget and a great, action adventure story like that. And just because she's so great. But that's mine is Kirk. Mary Jo?
I have the same thought, but not pizza, but chocolate. I would say Picard. If I had to put on if I was putting on a show to watch, I'd always choose. I always gravitate to TNG, but I like them all.
Well, now that we've reached the end of this show, you will both receive a commission and the rank of ensign. What department on the ship do you work in?
Science.
Yeah, I scientists. We'd like to be sociologists. So the sociologists.
Social scientists.
Yeah, social scientists, so we can get left behind on all the planets like they
Right.
they do on every time they have a sociologist on Star Trek, they leave them on the planet.
Yeah. I always like when they have it's our 20th century expert, like in this episode. Or like on, it always manifests itself like Tom Paris on Voyager. He likes the 20th century, so he's into like F-150s and Dr. Pepper and stuff like that. And maybe this is past the sophistication of writing for a 60s sci-fi TV show, but I want to see that dramatic irony of like what she thinks it's supposed to be like we get in Star Trek 4, where she's like, well, clearly they ride Pogs, to their slap bracelet factory or something like that. And they don't have it quite right.
Yeah, that would be hilarious, right? That would be great.
Well, Ensigns John and Mary Jo, thanks for joining me to talk about Star Trek and the Star Trek universe. If people want to continue the conversation, and they can, at EISTpod on Twitter and the Enterprising Individuals Facebook page, where can people find you online?
Best place is probably Twitter, just at Tenuto Family, and we share that account. So we'd love to talk with anybody through there and chit-chat about Star Trek.
Great. And you wrote a multi-part series on the development of this episode for StarTrek.com.
Yes, in fact, a little bit of news coming up hopefully sometime this year. We are going to be doing a group of articles taking a look at the characters of Mudd and Layla and the Romulan commander in a series of articles for StarTrek.com where the characters originally started. And we were able to talk to DC Fontana about it. And we're really, really excited about sharing how different the characters were when they were originally created and to eventually become the characters that we all love. Sort of a guest star famous guest character type of a series. So that's coming up hopefully sometime this year.
And people can get you on the series The Toys That Made Us, streaming now on Netflix.
They're going to be doing two seasons of 4 episodes, part A and part B of the season. They're going to do 4 episodes and 4 episodes. The first 4 will include an episode about Star Wars, and we're in that episode. And then the second 4, which should be sometime in 2018, early 2018, there's an entire episode about Star Trek and a big, deep dive into the Mego toy line.
Yeah.
And we're going to be in that one as well. And they're really great. It's a really great show where they're taking a look at the famous toy lines like Barbie and Star Trek and Star Wars and Transformers and He-Man and they're really they're talking to the people who created the toys, to the actors who the toy represents, to sometimes social scientists like ourselves and fans, and who share their collection. And it's a really loving, intelligent, really great, fun documentary where they really take a deep look at what these toys, how they were made and what they mean to us. And we're very excited about the Star Trek episode and the Star Wars episode, particularly because we think the Star Trek toys, they're really great. I mean, they've played a role even in the episodes themselves. So we always think of collectibles as the wedding rings of being a fan. It's our physical connection to this fictional place, and so we're really excited about that, and we hope that fellow fans check out the show.
Sure. Will we get a look at your collection on the show?
I believe so. Yeah, they filmed us they filmed us in front of our Star Trek collection and also our Star Wars collection. We get to share some of our favorites. And include we I don't know if we made the cut, but we talked about the marshmallow dispenser from Kraft. But we had a lot of fun, and it was great. We one of the fun moments was one of the people making the films is friends with Martha Hackett, and we of course had Seska action figures, and so we made a little video for her. And he sent it to her, so that was great.
That's neat. Well, thanks again for joining me on the show.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And we are signing off until the next mission. Hailing frequencies closed.
It's on your mind.